So it's about hiring, obviously, the right talent and knowing what you're looking for. I think so many sales directors do hire still on gut feel, and I see that every day in what we do, and they're leaning on us for advice in this area. And so what we do is we work hard with the clients to develop a scorecard from which they're recruiting to and look at situational and behavioural interviewing centred at that criteria. And that's through better understanding the selling environment before we articulate that document. So it seems as though there's an alignment there in terms of the way you guys are going about it as well, which is interesting. But what's falling short, I'm noticing, with sales directors is they've never really been trained on how to interview and how to test for these particular skills, which sort of brings me on to my next question. So some interesting stats coming out of your sales sustainability report. That were of particular interest to me as a sales recruiter. So I'll just go to the stats. 91% of companies expect an increase in sales revenue compared to 70% in 2014. So clearly the market's looking up.
Yes.
In terms of expectation.
Expectations, yes.
Now there were a good 20 to 30% of them I noted that were expecting 25% growth or more, which would substantially higher than what they're expecting this time last year. So some great sentiment out there in the market. You followed up the surveys with a question around what their strategies are going to be to get that growth, and what were their top 3 strategies. The top one above all else was recruiting more salespeople to the team. So more of what we've got is going to produce some top line revenue growth.
Sure.
Now, there's a few risks in that for me, but the one as a sales recruiter I'm most aware of is if they go about the sales recruitment process in a gut feeling sort of way or make the wrong hires.
Yeah.
It's not going to get them the results they want. What would your advice be to sales leaders that are growing their sales teams at the moment from a recruitment standpoint? What do they need to be focusing on from your point of view?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, it lends itself to, are we doing the same old thing we've always done? Or are we stepping up and doing things differently in light of today's opportunities that present themselves to us? For instance, being able to tap into a rigorous process and rigorous access to data. So I would start with moving away from gut feel. Sure, recognising the soft traits in a salesperson that you are looking for. So. Yep. The interpersonal skills, the alignment of values, things like their network, all of those things are really valid. But we can take a much more scientific approach these days to ensuring we get the right people on board. And similar to the work we do with assessing bench strength of sales teams once they're within the organisation, our recommendation is to bring that sort of a more rigour and science to the recruitment process so that we can, mitigate a level of risk in that final selection process before we actually end up hiring them and finding, week 1, week 2, oops, we've made a real mistake. Salespeople, I guess, true to form, are really good at talking up their strengths, their value, and rightly so. But being able to actually assess them in a real life environment prior to actually bringing them on. So in that final stage of recruitment, one of the pieces of work that we do a lot of with our clients is in that final sort of shortlist, putting them through a really rigorous assessment. So we call it a development centre, where we're asking them to show us how they actually perform in key scenarios that they'll need to participate in on an ongoing basis. So be that an acquisition type process, a high stakes customer meeting, it might be even how they manage pipeline across their portfolio. There's a range of things that you can assess if they're really critical to success in the role, which of course those are. And as I said, just taking a more rigorous approach to the assessment prior to bringing them on, because nothing beats actually seeing how someone performs live. There's references, there's success stories they'll bring along. A good salesperson, of course, will tell you all their strengths and it'll be documented really well, their recent wins. But there is this extra step that if you're really serious about mitigating risk, ensuring you've got the right person so they can kickstart day one and be able to start delivering strong results quickly, a more rigorous approach to assessing in that final stage is definitely something I'd think about.
Yeah, great. So I imagine what that looks like is setting up a scenario whereby they're acting out a client meeting or whatever part of the process you're trying to assess in front of the key stakeholders in the decision-making process and treating them as the customer in almost like a role-play scenario. Is that what that often looks like?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So it's pretty high stakes, and which is great too, because it sort of lets you see how somebody performs under pressure, which we're often under pressure. We're in front of a key decision maker. So yeah, that's exactly right. There's a range of scenarios. A typical scenario that we find is relevant for the clients that we work with is getting that discovery or exploratory meeting nailed. So the first opportunity you get to meet with that client, once again, it's important to have the competencies really clear that you're looking for. So it's the competencies are key because it's the finer details of those competencies that often let a salesperson down. So there's usually 2 or 3 key competencies that we are must-haves. The softer skills about questioning and listening and rapport and what have you, they're a given these days. So the competencies, you can
assess that in an interview as well. The things you're talking about here don't come out in the interview.
So those competencies that we're typically looking for are more around as I mentioned earlier, bringing that industry insight, asking the tough questions, challenging the customer, taking them on a good thinking journey, guiding them through that buying process.
That acumen you were talking about earlier.
Acumen, and insight and differentiation are sort of the 3 things that we'd be looking for any sort of top performing B2B salesperson.
Great, that makes sense.